Let's begin our discussion of vision by covering structures that you often see when you look in the mirror or when you're looking at your friends and family. That's this anterior view from the outside. When we look at someone's eyes, we often see eyebrows and eyelashes. These hairs help prevent particulates from landing on the eyeball and also shade the eye. We often look and see someone's pigment of the eye, whether it's a blue eye or a green eye or a hazel eye. That's the iris. The iris contains pigment, which is genetically determined. But more importantly is that the iris is a smooth muscle. It's an intrinsic muscle, meaning it's inside the eye. It's a smooth muscle, so it's involuntarily controlled by your autonomic nervous system. And it determines the size of your pupil, which is the hole within the iris. Covering this part of the eye is a transparent cornea. The cornea then becomes white. So the white part of the eye and the cornea are the same layer, except cornea is transparent and sclera is white. That sclera is covered by a thin membrane known as the conjunctiva. That conjunctiva covers both the sclera and the inside parts of the eyelids. You've probably heard of pink eye. Pink eye is inflammation of the conjunctiva. So when someone has pink eye, this inflammation can be seen as redness in the sclera, but it is not red on the cornea. That's because the cornea is not covered by the conjunctiva. We often call pink eye conjunctivitis. What else do we see? We see that there is a structure here located medially to the eye called the lacrimal caruncle. Now this structure does not produce tears, but instead drains tears from off the surface of the eye. To identify where tears are being produced, we're going to use this drawing. Located superior lateral to the eye are the lacrimal glands. Those lacrimal glands produce tears, which drain through lacrimal ducts onto the surface of the eye. These tears will help flush the eye, keep debris from landing on the eye, and also lubricate the eye. Those tears will then drain off the eye into two canaliculi, a superior canaliculus and an inferior canaliculus. The word canaliculus just means very small canal. Those canaliculi drain the tears into a sac called the lacrimal sac, eventually down a little duct, and then into the nasal cavity. So tears are constantly being produced at the gland and then drained onto the eye, off the eye, and then into the nasal cavity. Many drawings will show parts of the lacrimal apparatus. You should be able to identify lacrimal glands as well as understand the flow eventually into the nasal cavity. Let's then look at how an eyeball moves. An eyeball moves using 6 extrinsic eye muscles. These muscles are found outside of the eyeball and attached to the sclera, or the white of the eye. Before we get to the extrinsic eye muscles, I want to point out one muscle here that has been cut away. That muscle located above the eye extends and goes into the upper eyelid. This muscle we've learned in the past as being the levator palpebrae superioris because it elevates your upper eyelid. But let's look at the extrinsic eye muscles. There's a superior and inferior rectus. One's above the eye, one's below the eye. They're both parallel to the midline of the eyeball. There's a lateral rectus and a medial rectus, both parallel to the midline, one located laterally, the other one located medially. Finally, there are 2 oblique muscles. the superior oblique, which goes through the poli, known as a trochlea, and then finally the inferior oblique. Notice, due to their orientation, the oblique muscles move the eye in the opposite direction they are located. For instance, the superior oblique depresses the eye, whereas the inferior oblique elevates the eye. Both of these muscles also help to rotate the eye. So those are the 6 eye muscles. Collectively, they are innervated by the oculomotor nerve, the trochlear nerve, and the abducens nerve. Next, we're going to start looking at structures of the eyeball. To do this, we use this table from your textbook. It's a good table in that it covers the structure of the eye, it locates and highlights the structure on a simple drawing of the eye, and then correlates the structures with their specific functions. Then, once we're familiar with these structures, we're going to look at a more detailed image of the eyeball. But the eyeball can be thought of as having 3 layers, also known as tunics. The outer tunic is known as the fibrous tunic. The middle tunic is known as the vascular tunic. And then the inner tunic is known as the retina. So you have fibrous, colored here in blue, vascular, and retina. Let's look at the fibrous tunic first. It is a continuous outer layer made up of the cornea in the anterior and behind it being the sclera. We've mentioned these previously. The cornea is transparent, whereas the sclera is white. What are the functions of these two? The cornea admits light, which means lets it in. This is the most anterior portion of an eyeball. So light coming towards an eye must first go through the cornea. So it admits light, it lets the light in. It also refracts light. Refraction is bending of light rays. Refraction is one of the most important aspects of vision. Light rays must be bent as they enter the eyeball. This bending of the light allows the focal point to hit the retina properly. If light isn't bent properly, images are out of focus. The good news is most refractory problems can be corrected using lenses. The sclera is very tough. It provides the proper shape of the eyeball, but also protects internal structures. The next layer, collectively known as the vascular tunic, is made up of 3 structures. One structure we're already familiar with, the iris. The iris is a pigmented muscle, again, largely based on genetics, but that muscle is going to regulate how much light enters the eye. When the iris contracts, it constricts the pupil size. There are other muscles that are going to allow that iris to dilate the pupil. So this little opening here is the pupil. As light travels in to the eyeball, it goes through the cornea, through an area called the anterior chamber, through the pupil, then into the lens. And we'll learn about the lens in a moment. So the iris regulates how much light enters the eyeball. The next structure is known as the ciliary body. The ciliary body, also part of the vascular tunic, is situated in a place where you do not see it from the outside. It's found behind the iris and attaches to the lens. So that tells you that the ciliary muscle must have something to do with your lens. And it does. It alters the shape of the lens. The ciliary body has 2 major functions. One is to produce a fluid called aqueous humor. Humor is another name for a body fluid. This aqueous humor circulates into this forward chamber called the anterior chamber. We'll learn more about what the function of aqueous humor is. The other function is to alter the shape of the lens for near or far vision. We call this accommodation of the lens. Accommodation of the lens allows us to focus on close objects and then distant objects. This is done by altering this shape. The shape of the lens determines how much refraction the lens does. So I'll remind you in a moment that the job of the lens is similar to the cornea in that it refracts light. The major difference is you can't change your cornea, but you can change the lens. Finally, the rest of the vascular tunic is known as the choroid. The choroid contains blood vessels, and it also helps to absorb scattered light. Finally, we have the inner layer known as the retina. As you can imagine, the retina is extremely important in that it contains the light-sensitive neurons called photoreceptors. The retina contains photoreceptors as well as other neurons that help to transmit the action potentials out of the eye within the optic nerve. We'll be looking closer at the retina, but it contains rods and cones for photoreception and ganglion cells that transmit out as the optic nerve. You'll notice that the retina does not completely surround both the anterior and posterior. It's situated more posteriorly, and it acts almost like a catcher's mitt for light. So when light enters from all different directions, it gets hit and detected at different parts of the retina. For instance, your central vision will hit right at the back of the eyeball, whereas your peripheral vision will hit at the peripheral parts of the retina. In the next video, we're going to continue looking at these structures.